bear with us as we find our feet, but we're really excited to kick off this series today with two such fantastic speakers. I'll begin by acknowledging the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, traditional custodians of the land on which I'm speaking, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. The asking of questions and the sharing of wisdom has been ongoing on this land for millennia, and I extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people present. So we have two fantastic speakers today to share their perhaps whirlwind experiences during the last couple of years and maybe some insights for our discipline, some lessons for our discipline. They'll each be speaking for sort of 20-25 minutes and then hopefully some time for questions at the end. Please pop your questions into the chat as we go, and I'll keep an eye on them, and keep your microphone on mute otherwise. So I'll begin by introducing Adrian Esterman, who's the Chair of Biostatistics and Epidemiology at the University of South Australia, and he's been in that position for some 17 years. He served for 5 years as a WHO staff member in Geneva and also the European Office in Copenhagen, and was for many years the principal epidemiologist for the South Australian Department of Health. We've got two kind of Twitter celebrities with us today, which is pretty exciting. A combined 100,000 followers on deck between these two. And I can only imagine what that is like. Surely it's a full-time job just dealing with your notifications. But as the title suggests, Adrian's going to be reflecting on that whirlwind journey from academic to COVID celebrity. So please take it away, Adrian.
Yeah, thanks very much, Taya. I'll start off by saying that I don't normally talk about myself. I'm usually quite a modest person, so this is quite unusual. The second thing is I'm hopeless with technology, so hopefully I can share the screen and get it working. I normally have to rely on my daughter to help me do these things. Now, can you see that, everyone?
Yep.
Hopefully?
Yes,
good.
perfect.
Excellent. So look, before I start talking about my ridiculous journey from absolute neophyte in terms of social media to a bit of a media star, I thought I'd talk a little bit about how I actually got to be an epidemiologist in the first place, because I started off life with a degree in statistics. So there we are. So I left school at 16, believe it or not. I was always good at maths and English at school, and but I was very badly bullied at school, and by the time I got to the age of 16, I thought, bugger it, I can't stand this anymore, and I left. And I got a job with a very large international company called Unilever as a sort of junior accounts clerk. And I did that for several years. But, you know, I was always good at stats and maths, as I said, at school. And I decided that I would do some night classes in statistics and computing. So I did that for a couple of years. And then at the age of 20, Unilever recognized that I was good at statistics and asked me to help them design some animal feeding studies. So I was doing that. And at the age of 20, I decided I wanted to go to university, and I asked Unilever if they would sponsor me, and they told me to bugger off. So I thought, well, that's no good. So I actually decided that I would get to university in my own right without having any sponsorship. So I looked around, because I decided I wanted to do a degree in statistics. I looked around for what would be a good university. And one of the really good up and coming universities in those days, it was only been going for 4 years, was the University of Bath. So I looked up who the head of that statistics department was, and went to the library and found out that he was an expert in this really obscure branch of statistics. I can't remember what it was now, but let's just call it Chebyshev polynomials. So I mugged up on Chebyshev polynomials. I then took a train to Bath, took a bus to the university, wandered around the university till I found the School of Maths, went to his office, knocked on the door, and he was in. So I introduced myself. I told him that I had no school leaving, but I was really interested in doing a degree in statistics, and I absolutely loved Chebyshev polynomials. Well, he could have fallen over backwards, and he actually offered me a place on the course there and then. Of course, you couldn't do that these days, but in those days, you know, the prof was actually the dictator. He could do what they wanted, and that's how I got to start my degree in statistics. It was a 4 years honours degree. I found the first year incredibly difficult because I didn't have any of that advanced mathematics and stats. and it was mainly sort of analysis and stuff like that, pure maths. But I got through it. Importantly, it was a sandwich degree. And if you don't know what that is, it means that you spend 2 6-month periods of the 4-year degree working in industry. So my first placement was a bit boring, working in a factory. But my second placement was in the Medical Research Council laboratories in London, which I really, really enjoyed, and did some mathematical modeling of infectious diseases. We invented the humicrib, all sorts of wonderful things. And I decided there and then that I wanted to be a medical statistician. So once I'd got my honours degree, I applied to do a master's of medical statistics at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. To my delight, I was accepted. My supervisor was Professor Peter Armitage, who I'm sure many of you have heard of, who was a wonderful supervisor. We had a very small cohort of students. Half of them were doctors, the other half statisticians. So the doctors studied basic biostatistics and epidemiology. We, however, had intensive courses in anatomy, physiology, pathology, microbiology, almost first-year medicine, as well as, of course, advanced courses in demography, medical statistics, and epidemiology, and some infectious disease epidemiology. And of course, that really set me up to be able to communicate with doctors and medical researchers. So, and I think it's just a wonderful program and highly recommended. So I got my master's degree and then got accepted as a junior research fellow in the University of Aberdeen in their medical school. And my office was actually in their pathology museum. So I was surrounded by glass jars with fetuses and brains of serial killers. It was quite interesting. Now, I was happily working there in the Department of Community Medicine, enjoying myself, when totally out of the blue, I got a telegram. So I can show you how old it was. I got a telegram from the World Health Organization. Here's their head office in Geneva. And the telegram said, "Are you interested in a job in Geneva? If so, please take the next flight out." Well, I was absolutely gobsmacked. So I jumped on the plane, got to Geneva, and was offered a job on the spot in their strengthening of health services division. It turned out that Peter Armitage was a WHO consultant, and WHO had asked Peter if he could recommend a good young junior statistician, and he put my name forward without telling me. So that's how I got into WHO in Geneva. And it was absolutely amazing time, apart from the fact that you were on a tax-free salary and paid to fly around the world all the time. It was a time when we had the barefoot doctors, we had strengthening of health services, we had public health was just really taking off in those days. And for example, to show the sort of thing you can do when you're in that position. I was working with the Global Immunization Program, which was giving, vaccines all over the world to young kids. And they were using glass syringes. And the problem with glass syringes is that they're expensive and they break. So I got asked whether they could be replaced with plastic syringes. So I ran a series of trials which demonstrated that plastic syringes work extremely well and could still be disinfected well. And so the whole global program of immunization changed from glass to plastic. So, I mean, just little me was making huge changes around the world, which was absolutely amazing. So working there, you not only felt you're at the center of public health in the world, but you actually were in the center of public health in the world. And that could make a huge difference. After 5 years there, I was actually promoted and asked to move to their European office in Copenhagen. I didn't want to because I love Geneva. I love skiing every winter, cycling in the mountains in the summer. But unfortunately, when you join the UN system, you have to sign a form that says you'll go anywhere in the world if they want you to. So I got posted to Copenhagen, where I was a sort of statistician for the European office. And my job was basically to try and get member countries to all collect the same health statistics. So I was constantly traveling around Europe doing that. But after 2 years in Copenhagen, my wife and we got married there in Copenhagen, were absolutely sick of the cold weather. I think the top temperature I ever got to was 20 degrees in 2 years. And we decided we wanted to move somewhere warmer, and so we migrated to Australia. And that happened in 1981. We didn't have jobs. My wife was pregnant, much to my horror. I wasn't horrified at her being pregnant. I was just horrified it happened as we were moving continents. I didn't have a job. But anyway, got to Australia, went to Perth, there was no jobs there. and got to Adelaide, and I got offered a job on the spot. And that was with the Department of Health, South Australian Department of Health, which in those days was called the Health Commission. And I became the principal epidemiologist and head of their health statistics unit. I also worked very closely with the Notifiable Diseases Control Unit and became very, very familiar with the outbreak investigation. Another early research project was with the Engineering and Water Supply Department, where I undertook studies to work out how much chlorine residual was required in swimming pools and spas to ensure that they were safe from pathogens. And those findings are still in the regulations of several countries, including CDC Atlanta. At the same time, I was working with the late Professor Barry Marmion, developing a new vaccine for Q fever. And that work subsequently got published in The Lancet. After many years working for SA Health, I finally moved into academia as a senior research fellow at Flinders University. And while there, I completed my PhD in epidemiology. So I've now got sort of a foot in each camp. And the funny thing is that my PhD was about foot function, so hence a foot in each camp. Never mind about that one. Anyway, in 2005, the Deputy Vice Chancellor, Professor Ron McDermott of UniSA, heard that I was looking for a new job and offered me a professorship at UniSA. And I must like it because I've now been there 17 years. So the reason I've been actually telling all of this is that my qualifications and experience cover both biostatistics and epidemiology. And although I'm not formally trained as an infectious disease epidemiologist, I certainly know enough about it to talk sensibly. So, of course, in early 2020, coronavirus hit us. Now, I was obviously very interested in it, having an interest in infectious disease epidemiology, and I read up every scientific paper there was about it, of which there was about 100. I read about all the media stories. And by early March of 2020, I probably knew as much about COVID-19 as anyone in Australia. Now, as I said, in those days, there was only about 100 published papers. Now we have over 250,000 papers, as well as thousands of preprints. So anyway, I knew a fair amount about it. And I've always enjoyed writing. I think I mentioned when I first started that I was always good at maths and English at school. So I've always enjoyed writing. And I thought, why don't I write about COVID-19? I kept being bombarded with questions from colleagues and family about what to do about masks and what to do about washing hands and so on. So I thought I'd write down everything I knew. And I discovered this website called Medium. And Medium is like a blogging space where you can just write stories and you even get paid. And so I wrote a story for Medium. And it was all about, as I said, everything I know about COVID-19. Here's actually the title of a story, COVID-19 Facts and Fiction, which is still online with Medium. And much to my amazement, I got thousands of people reading it. I couldn't believe it. So then I started writing more articles. So I wrote one on a history of clinical trials. I wrote one about whether measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine could give you cross immunity. And so it went on. And each one got thousands of reads, and I actually earned about $2.50 from all that writing. Anyway, at that stage, University of South Australia had been pushing us to use social media. And I hate social media. I'm too old to use social media. I didn't see why it would be useful. And I had no intention of promoting myself. I didn't need to. I couldn't get much further than where I am now. But I thought, why not tell people about my Medium articles on Twitter? Now, at that stage, I had no followers. Okay. In fact, even though I'd sort of joined Twitter in 2014, I think I'd made about 3 tweets. So I thought, well, why don't I just try and promote my Medium article on Twitter? And so I started using Twitter. And here's a typical page from my Twitter stream. Everyone on Twitter has got a profile page. Here's mine. And this is from last Monday. You'll see that at the top left, I made over 4,600 tweets since I started in 2020. At the bottom, you can see that I follow 3,343 other people, and I've got 33,500 followers myself In the middle, you're allowed to say something about yourself, and it's important that you make it interesting so that more people read it. So you see, I've got a lovely quote from Winnie the Pooh, which is one of my favorites. I also say opinions are my own. Now, this is a very interesting one. The reason I put that there is because everyone else does it. But when you think about it, does it have any legal standing? Can someone sue you? Can the university sue you? I mean, I didn't start off my talk at lunchtime saying these opinions are my own. But I mean, so at some stage, I really must ask our legal department whether it actually has any standing in law. Now, Twitter has got an analytics page. So if I just go back to the previous slide, you'll see where the 3 dots are over there. You click on that and go for analytics. And this is what comes up for me again. This was for last Monday. And what you see is that I've made 286 tweets in the last 28 days, which is roughly what I normally do. Tweet impressions are the people who've seen my tweets. So in the last 28 days, 4 million people have seen my tweets. I've had 751,000 people visit my profile page. Nearly 5,000 people have actually used my @ProfEsterman Twitter handle. And then finally are the followers. And then it talks about your top tweets, etc. So this is how you can actually track, how well you're doing. Unfortunately, you don't get paid for this sort of thing, which is a great pity. What do I tweet? Well, this is the sort of thing. So again, this is from Monday. So I take each state and territory. I say how many cases there were, how many deaths there were. I calculate the effective reproduction number, which I'll talk about in a minute. I talk about how many people are in hospital and how many people are in ICU. Now, until I started tweeting this, the effective reproduction number, which is the average number of people each case then infects themselves, could only be calculated through mathematical modeling. And it was only given out once every few weeks when the mathematical modelers updated their models. But I thought there has to be an easy way of getting this. And it turns out that the generation time, which is the time from being infected to infecting someone else, is about 4 days for Omicron. It was 5 days for Delta. So I thought, well, why don't I just take today's case numbers divided by the case numbers 4 days ago? That should give us a very rough estimate of the ref. The trouble with that is that case numbers go up and down like a yo-yo because of random fluctuation, and the fact is that more people go on a Wednesday than go on a Sunday to get tested, etc. So I then decided to use moving averages. So I took today's 7-day moving average divided by the 7-day moving average 4 days ago and used that. It turned out to be very close to what mathematical modelers were getting. So I could actually update the ref for each state and territory every day. And of course, it became incredibly popular. It's been used by politicians and journalists, and it's been used by one of the big sites that collect COVID-19 data. They now publish my ref numbers. So that was quite interesting. I never actually published any of this, which is a great pity. And then an Italian group have just published all the maths behind it now. So missed out on all of that. It doesn't really matter. So that was all good. And the other thing I do very occasionally is I do some projections just using log normal regression. This was done quite some time ago, but it showed what would happen if the ref was unchanged. Nice thing about Twitter is you interact with people, lots and lots of people, and you get some very, very rude tweets. People saying, you should die for recommending children get vaccinated, that sort of thing, which I tend to ignore. My daughter taught me always to ignore these people, and so I never reply to them. But nice thing is you also get some nice tweets like this one. Who's your favorite epidemiologist? So this was two editors talking to newspaper editors. Oh, has to be Professor Esterman. So that was really nice. Then it turns out that there's an online website, which I'm sure most of you know, called The Conversation. And one of the health editors of The Conversation had actually seen some of my Medium articles and asked me to write an article for them. Now, this is most unusual because the conversation, you normally have to sort of pitch an article to them and they decide whether to accept it or not. But in this case, they actually asked me to write an article for them. And Medium is absolutely fantastic. It has some of Australia's best editors and journalists, and they do a fantastic job. And the whole thing is funded by the universities and donations. So anyway, they asked me to write an article. And this is actually my first article I wrote about whether we could eliminate COVID-19. And it had over 58,000 reads, much to my amazement. And it was widely picked up by the media. So because it was so successful, I was quickly asked to write another article about opening borders, which was published 2 weeks later. And that had 40,000 reads. And that began my writing career with The Conversation. My most popular piece, which was fairly recent, was all about South Australia's, was all about COVID test results being false positives and how common are they? And that had over 500,000 reads. Now, like Twitter, The Conversation has got an analytics page. This is what the analytics page for The Conversation looks like. So what you can see is that so far I have published 24 articles, 2 this year so far. I've had over 2 million readers. And I've had nearly 2,000 comments as part of these conversation articles I've posted. So I like writing for The Conversation. They normally say, can you write us an article on X? And I sort of send them back some ideas, and it's a great sort of interaction with their editors. And these articles are amazingly picked up by newspapers, the ABC, journalists. So if you ever get a chance to write an article for The Conversation, or I've got a great idea and want to pitch it to them, I highly recommend it, and it can do your career a world of good. Now, let's look at about sort of the more mainstream media as opposed to social media. I typically field 3 or 4 queries from journalists a day and do at least 1 radio interview. And I do TV interviews once or twice a week. The TV interviews are either live to air or they're pre-recorded. Thing about when you do a pre-recorded interview is that it usually ends up being a 1-minute soundbite and often out of context. So it's much better if you can actually go live and talk live. If the studio is feeling really good, the producer will send you a list of questions, which is fantastic, so you can brief yourself before you go on air. And of course, the news anchor always throws in a curly one at the end they didn't tell you about. Going to the various TV studios is absolutely amazing, especially in Adelaide. So in Adelaide, all of the studios have got skeletal staff. There's almost no one there. I once made the silly mistake of asking the ABC that if they had a makeup artist. The reason I did that was because I'd had some solar keratosis taken off my head and I was covered in red spots. They disabused me that no, they didn't have any makeup artists. Perhaps my biggest TV interview was for Euronews, which goes out live to 430 million households in 166 countries. It's not so much fun actually going to the studios. I was once asked to go on the 7:30 report, and they got me in this tiny, tiny little room, which was pitch black, sitting on a very tall stool with no sort of footrests, peering at a camera for about an hour. It was most uncomfortable, but that's such is life. At radio, now I do love radio interviews, especially talkback shows, and I appear regularly on 5AA and ABC News. In fact, I'm doing 5AA this afternoon, but they do have their moments. I was on an ABC talkback show a few weeks ago, and a caller said that she just had her first AstraZeneca vaccination and was very sick for a few days, and was that normal? So I pointed out that meant her immune system was working properly and reacting to the vaccine. So the next caller comes on and says, well, I've just had my AstraZeneca and I didn't have any effects. Does that mean it's not working? So you constantly try to field all these sorts of things. And I was on ABC Drive recently, and in the middle of the show, the presenter suddenly asked me if I had a puppy, which totally threw me. And it turned out that my puppy was under my desk squeaking a toy and I couldn't hear it. So radio, especially live chat shows, can be really good fun, and I do enjoy doing them. I've also been on several international radio programs like BBC Radio 4, Russian Sputnik, and in fact, yesterday I was interviewed by South Korean radio. So those can all be really good fun. As for print and online stuff, I'm constantly fielding questions from journalists. I'm very happy to do this, as often it's very difficult for journalists to make sense of the latest research. Now, usually we don't get paid for any of this stuff at all. I was very lucky to actually get paid twice by The Guardian for writing opinion pieces for them. It was a grand sum of $300 each time, but I mean, that's the best I've done so far, apart from the $2 I got from Medium. But our UniSA's media department recently analysed the amount of media time each staff member had for 2021. So they actually counted how many sort of equivalent hours of time that you had in the media. I was ranked #1 for the university, and they could actually cost it because you have to purchase advertiser time. And they estimated that my worth in terms of media time for 2021 was $95 million. They did suggest that I get a big fat pay rise. So I did actually forward that email over to our Vice Chancellor, who didn't respond, which is a great pity. So although I get very little financial reward out of being a media personality, I do get wonderful comments like this that makes the whole thing worthwhile. So I'll probably stop there and leave it to the next presenter.
Thanks very much, Adrian. I've got a few questions and I'm sure other attendees do too. But that's a really interesting behind the curtain glimpse into what goes into a couple of years like the years you've had. And over to Gideon.
Hi all, yeah. Let me just bring my presentation up. I'll quickly introduce myself. I am Gideon Mavritz-Katz. I'm an epidemiologist. I work in New South Wales in the public system, and I'm also a PhD candidate with the University of Wollongong. You might have seen me on Twitter if you follow me on Twitter. I'm @GidMK. I tweet about a lot of things, and today I'm just going to be giving you a bit of an overview of something that's been something of a passion of mine during the pandemic and a little bit before, but not so much before, which is looking at error correction in science. So let me just get this working properly. Perfect. Basically, I'm going to be going over kind of the beginning and before the pandemic, bad science, really bad science, looking at a little bit of kind of fraud and then a bit more fraud, and then some basic tips that I thought might be useful to you guys. And when I say useful to you, what I mean is that you're probably all much better at statistics than I am, because I have a Master of Public Health. I've almost finished my PhD. I've done biostatistics in the sense that in a practical epidemiological sense, but the maths still confuses me, and I have to look up every time I do any statistics. I have to go back to my books and look up what I'm doing. And most of the uncovering of fraudulent or extremely poor quality research that I've done has been really simple mathematically and statistically. So my tips are going to be more focused on, I think, the things that anyone could in theory do. And I'm not going to really go into the stats too much. Okay, so before the pandemic, error correction in science was kind of, it's kind of looked down upon, frowned upon by a lot of people. The idea is that you're like destroying other people's work by pointing out mistakes. And there is no incentive, or there was before the pandemic, there still is no incentive to do this work. So the people who do it tend to be people like me. I've got a full-time job and a PhD, and then occasionally on Saturday mornings, I start looking at flawed studies, or I have phone calls 2 a.m. to discuss a piece of research with people in the United States. And it's kind of, people who are slightly outside of the scientific norm, who are doing this work in their own time. And editors, authors, universities, people who have power within kind of academia tend not to think that it's a useful activity. It's certainly not rewarded in any tangible sense. You don't get citations, you don't get publications or grants or anything like that for doing this work. And so it takes forever. There is no incentive at any stage for anyone to listen to you if you're pointing out mistakes in research. I thought I'd give you a couple of examples of this. So one one slightly older example. There's a professor called Brian Wansink from Cornell University. He headed what was called the Food and Brand Lab. In I think it was 2015, concerns were first raised about one of his research papers, and then a number of other research papers quite soon after. From the time that concerns were first raised to the time when one of his papers was retracted was about 3 years. He's now lost his job. It turns out he's not quite on the retraction watch leaderboard. He's not the most retracted scientist, but I think that's more because journals have stopped responding to people's emails than it is because he doesn't have enough studies that are potentially fraudulent. I believe over a dozen of his papers have been retracted because the data for them basically doesn't exist. He couldn't come up with data once the basic numeric errors were raised in the published research. A more recent example of this sort of stuff, I should just say that there were 4 scientists, 4 people who did all of that work. Of them, I don't think any of them are still in academia. They've all left academia. This was something of a scarring experience, I think, because they spent years trying to get editors to listen to them to say these numbers are fake. And when people finally did, there was no reward, and their names are barely even mentioned. They got no publications or anything like that. This is a more recent example where someone plagiarized from someone else in 2005, and it took 17 years for the paper to be retracted. It's not uncommon. The median time from concerns first being raised to action being taken on a paper is extremely long, and I've seen that myself. So going back to the beginning of the pandemic, Prof. Esterman noted this as well. There was a huge surge in publication. There was basically no emphasis on quality control. A lot of papers were being published within a day, within a week, and a huge surge in preprints. I actually think a lot of people are a bit too harsh on preprints. I don't think that there's anything specifically wrong with preprints, but it did increase in number very dramatically, as well as published papers. And this is just I've taken a couple of images from a Nature article that looked at the increase in publication. And this kind of shows you, I think this was an interesting one. The article is worth reading. I've put a link there. Happy to send around my slides. But basically, the review process was so quick for a lot of COVID research. There wasn't much oversight on papers that were being put in, and the peer review was rapidly accelerated. And I think that led to, so I don't think that there's anything specific about the pandemic, in that I don't think that there were any problems that are caused by COVID-19 per se in terms of bad science or fraud. I think what it did, though, was accelerate the whole process and make it much easier for bad actors to get things published. So an example of that, this is a very famous paper. It is well on its way to being the most cited paper of the pandemic. I checked yesterday, Google Scholar says it's been cited 5,500 times. Google Scholar tend to overestimate citations, so I wouldn't be surprised if it was a bit less than that, but still, it's a remarkable number of citations. It is the initial trial of hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin from France that started the whole hydroxychloroquine craze throughout the world. It is arguably one of the most influential papers of the pandemic because it has caused many hundreds of millions of people to receive hydroxychloroquine as a treatment over the last 2 years. It also is bad. And that's not my opinion. That is the opinion of Dr. Rosendahl, Professor Rosendahl, who was an independent expert commissioned by the journal. I think it was actually commissioned by the Springer to review the paper and give his opinion. And the opinion was that the paper was fully irresponsible and that it was so methodologically weak that it probably shouldn't have been published. There have been several other critiques. There is currently an ongoing criticism that it potentially has some fraud within the paper as well. But even if you ignore any of the other issues, the independent assessment is damning about whether this paper should have been published. This paper was pre-printed and published within 24 hours in a journal where there were quite significant conflicts of interest between the authors and the editorial team of the journal. And as I said, one of the most influential papers of the pandemic, one of the most well-cited papers of the pandemic as well. That's not the overall. That's not everything. So one of my favorite examples is terrible vitamin D research that was done at the beginning of the pandemic. I've got 3 papers that all did the exact same thing, and they're all terrible and should definitely not have been published. I'm sure you could find hundreds more. All these papers did the same thing. They took estimates of vitamin D levels, which were produced in the 90s and early noughties. So there's a systematic review of vitamin D levels across European and other, global, they call it global, a systematic review of the global burden, level of vitamin D. But most of the estimates they included in that systematic review were decades old, because those were the most recent estimates of vitamin D. And so people correlated those estimates of vitamin D with whatever the case or death counts for COVID-19 were on the day that they decided to do their analysis. And I can see a couple of people laughing, telling this to a crowd of biostatisticians. I'm sure you can see flaws in that analysis, but if you look at that last one, which has a count of accesses, citations, and the altmetric score, I mean, this was a hugely influential paper that is statistical nonsense. I mean, it's just gibberish. And yet published in a decent journal, and as much a part of the academic literature as anything that is objectively more robust. And then there's really bad science. The distinction between bad science that's never going to be retracted and really bad science is in this case just that it has been retracted. This one is a slightly more complex example. I encourage you to read our commentary of Matters Arising, and also the Matters Arising by a professor of mathematics from San Diego University, because they actually have some fun statistics in it that I didn't do, that my colleagues did. But basically, this paper, which has been read, as you see, by 400,000 people, and has had an objectively large impact on policy, said that lockdowns had no impact on COVID-19 deaths. That was the finding of the authors, that COVID-19 deaths are not influenced at all by staying at home. And we proved that not only does their statistical model produce noise no matter what so firstly, Professor Goes proved mathematically that the model produces noise no matter what you put into it. And we demonstrated that in a series of analyses using either model data or real world data, that no matter what you put into this model, it says that lockdowns don't work. So we actually, or it doesn't find any correlations between lockdowns and deaths. This is from our Matters Arising, our paper, where what we did was we created a one-to-one correlation between lockdowns and deaths, where staying home actually caused deaths in a perfect one-to-one correlation, and the model they created couldn't find a correlation at all with this. So, and we did six different models proving that it just doesn't work. And it was eventually retracted. It took nearly a year to get retracted, though. So in a pandemic, for a paper that was being read by hundreds of thousands of people, that was influencing policy on a global scale, that was cited by the Brazilian government in their opposition to lockdowns, and it still took, I think, 9 months from the day we first raised our concerns to the day the paper was retracted. Sorry, so this is the timeline. Yeah, March 14th to December the 7th was when the editors first noted our concerns to when the paper was retracted. And I think one thing that I think is useful to point out here is that this is actually a best case scenario. These were really responsive editors who cared and who thought that it was important. They didn't just publish the paper, publish our Matters Arising and leave it at that. They got it peer reviewed by independent statistical experts. And they wanted to be really sure, not just that the paper was flawed, but that it was flawed enough that they should retract it entirely. And they did that. And the problem is that 9 months is far too long in a pandemic. And it's a hard problem to solve. I don't have a good answer to what we can do to improve that, because by any academic standard, the editors did everything right here. And then we've got fraud. Moving swiftly on to some fun fraud. This paper was a very famous vitamin D study. It was in the news quite a bit, cited 100 times as recent, and the most recent citation I could find was December 2021. It has been deleted off SSRN because it's fake. So I'm going to give you a fun exercise for statisticians. I thought you would enjoy this. 20 seconds, really, really quick. Who wants, or not even 20 seconds, just give me some things that you can see that are incorrect or impossible about this table. And I should say, don't think about study design. Don't think about like your usual measures of bias or whatever. Just think about like basic maths. What basic maths doesn't add up here? Anyone got some examples? Yeah, Adrian.
Yeah, you can't have 253 and 68. Actually, you can. All right, take that all back. I can't add up.
Look at the next line. Okay, so yes, addition errors. It's not the one I highlighted, but yes, addition errors. If you look at the sex, it says 400 female, and then 128 plus 332 does not equal 400. That's a mistake.
And neither 52 and 68.
Yes, exactly. Same. They don't. It doesn't add up. So one problem, if you look at the weighted average of those two averages, it does not equal 54.5, and it's a sufficiently large difference that it cannot be due to a rounding mistake. That's obviously not correct. The percentages are too similar. There are repeated numbers within a table of results, which is a classic sign of someone just making numbers up. And something that's always good to look at, if you look at the trailing digits of 3-digit numbers, this is based on Benford's distribution. It should, in theory, be relatively random. It's not quite random. For a 3-digit number, it should be, goes from about 10.4% down to 9.6% of the trailing digits should be any specific digit. The trailing digits in this table are decidedly suspicious. There are no 4s or 5s at the end of any of these 3-digit numbers, which is just remarkably unusual. It would be, if you tested this against the expected distribution, you'd find that there's a statistically significant difference between the two. So lots of signs of potential fraud. And this is just a summary table with a few rows in this otherwise fraudulent study. I mean, I thought that'd be fun, a fun exercise, but the study itself, a group of people, if you click this link, you can have a look at it. A group of people did a really deep dive into this. They proved that it was fake, and shortly after they proved that the study was fake, it was taken off SSRN, and it appears to have basically been some guy just created a study that was completely fraudulent, and not even with his name on it. Just wrote a fake study and posted it online. Which is bizarre because none of the authors exist. They aren't people. He just posted it on medRxiv, and it's been cited 100 times. Sorry, it was posted on SSRN, not medRxiv. So that study, the stakes were relatively small because it was one of hundreds of studies on vitamin D that were overly popular, cited by a lot of people. Surgisphere, much more famous example, serious stakes behind this particular fakery. They published 3 papers, this group of authors in the United States. There was one, this one is a screenshot of their SSRN preprint. They also had one in the New England Journal of Medicine and one in the Lancet. The Lancet one was the most famous because it was the one investigated by The Guardian. They found that the study claimed to find, the one in the Lancet claimed to find that hydroxychloroquine increased the risk of death from COVID-19. Very famous because overnight the World Health Organization stopped the hydroxychloroquine arm in their Solidarity trial. It was huge news because hydroxychloroquine obviously had been promoted quite a bit and shortly withdrawn. If you're interested in the full story, I can tell you a bit more about it, but basically Australia and Australian researchers, and actually I had a small part in this, were important in getting it retracted because we noticed that the numbers for Australia couldn't possibly be true. because they, for some reason, they decided to include a column of Australia in their continents, and all of the numbers were just not just implausible, but easily identifiable as fake at the time. And this is an example of fraud where everything went right. There was a huge amount of scrutiny on this paper. It was published on May the 22nd. By May 24th, people had raised questions. By May 26th, the Guardian article saying that there were irregularities in it was published, and it was retracted the week after. It still did have an overnight impact because obviously the World Health Organization changed policy based on this paper, but that was quickly reversed, so it didn't have long-lasting impact. I'm going to keep this really brief because I don't want to run over, but we've also been looking at ivermectin fraud for a while. Ivermectin is an antiparasitic medication. You may have heard of it if you've been looking at the news. It's actually, ivermectin is the thing that got me on TV. I was on the BBC talking about fake studies, which was made my mum very proud, I think. But this systematic review and meta-analysis, which is one of the most viewed papers of all time ever. It now has an expression of concern, but basically the statistical model in the meta-analysis is based on 2 studies. I've highlighted those there, El-Ghazar and Niai et al. Those 2 studies are fake, and they provide the entire benefit on mortality seen by this meta-analysis and most meta-analyses of the time. El-Ghazar et al. We found to be fake. I mean, the first thing I noticed was the very low quality of the research, but my colleague Carl Sheldrick noticed the impossible standard deviations, that they reported standard deviations that couldn't possibly exist. And Jack Lawrence, who was the one who raised the alarm on this, he noticed that most of it was plagiarized. He's very good at noticing plagiarism, which I am not great at, but he just glanced at it and said, oh yeah, that's fake. When we looked at the data file, I mean, once you looked at the data, anyone could tell that it was fake. They had one column of, it was, I think, lymphocyte number, no, not lymphocytes, vitamin D, maybe, something like that. It was a blood test, and they didn't have a single number ending in 0 out of 600 people that they tested. It's just very obviously fake. Niai et al. Is the other paper. The most obvious tell for this one is that there are massive differences between the patients at baseline that you can identify even from their summary statistics. When I say massive, like they had not a single patient who had SpO2 below 70 in the intervention groups. All of those patients were allocated to the control somehow, which is blood oxygenation. So most of those people who were very, very severely unwell were allocated to control somehow. But also, when you look at the data file, there are clear signs of fabrication. So the trailing digits of lymphocytes, you shouldn't just have 0s and 5s in a blood test where a computer spits out a number. That's genuinely bizarre, and there are dozens of signs of data fabrication in the data set. Samaha et al., I thought I'd just give you one more example of ivermectin fraud because this is my favorite. This study, if you read it, very little that was fishy. It looked to be a low risk of bias, well done clinical trial, but had only one thing that anyone could notice. I noticed this when I read it the second time, which is that if you look at the numbers they report, the Cohen's d of the difference between the 2 groups is 3.2, which for a drug that people were unsure worked at all seemed a bit unlikely. That giving ivermectin would within 3 days clinically cure almost everyone in the intervention group, while almost no one in the control group got better at all. It's just a little bit odd. So we asked for the data, and in this case, the authors were happy to provide it. And it turns out that the data file is the most fake thing that I've ever seen. So I've highlighted some sections here so you can have a look. It's just a screenshot from Excel, but they just copy pasted the same rows over and over again, which is wonderful. I mean, not wonderful, but amazing. I think that the guy who sent the data to us in this case didn't realize the data file was fake. Otherwise, he never would have done this. But yeah, study's now been retracted. It was just wild. So my basic tips, and I think what you may have taken away from this is that most of the time when I'm finding things that I find as an epidemiologist looking at bad science and fraud, I look at really basic stuff. Like one of the tells that I've noticed in many papers for scientific misconduct is simply that people don't add up very well, and they don't calculate their percentages correctly. And if you find more than a few of every paper has at least one numeric error, because there are hundreds, every paper that's not funded by the pharmaceutical industry, where someone is paid to make sure that every number is correct, has at least one error, because no one has hundreds of hours to go through every single number and make sure there isn't a single percentage point out of line. But if you see many of them in a single paper over and over again, it's just a huge red flag. And that's just addition and multiplication and division. You know, it's not, I'm not running statistical models on any of this. Professor Ben Moll from University of Monash does have a great checklist that you can run through to look at signs of scientific misconduct. I don't know if it's published yet, but they are looking to publish that checklist. But basically, my tip is be a suspicious bastard and assume that things are wrong until the authors prove otherwise. Because I can't teach you how to be better statisticians, I wouldn't know how, and I'm much worse statistician than everyone here, I'm sure, but I am a reasonably good suspicious bastard, and it's a good thing to be. And finally, I will leave you with this note. It's a little bit depressing, but people hate you for doing this. You get invited to lovely talks from wonderful biostatisticians. You may get a few more followers on Twitter, although that's not guaranteed. But also the authors will hate you. The editors, I still have several editors at prominent medical journals like the like JAMA, Journal of American Medical Association, who dislike me quite a lot. So if I didn't work for the public health system, if I was purely an academic, I might be a bit worried about that. Given that I have no plans to go into academia full time in the future, it's less of a concern, but it is true that you have to be careful and you have to be prepared for something for it to be years before anyone even gets back to you about studies. There is the Niai et al. Study that I mentioned earlier. It is demonstrably fake. We've proven that in a number of different ways, and the editors have just stopped replying to our emails. So I will stop sharing now.
Thanks very much. Very interesting talk to me both. And apologies for not introducing you properly, Gideon. I'll note that you've also been publishing a lot on Medium and also in The Guardian.
Yeah, I write for The Guardian and a few other places these days.
Interesting commonality between the both of you, that those, Twitter and The Guardian and Medium, are the places where you've been really pushing your work out, both of you. I might ask a question about that later, but we have a couple of questions in the chat. Paul asks, Adrian, do you have any tips on communicating statistical issues with the public, particularly on explaining maybe thorny concepts while maintaining technical accuracy?
Yeah, very much so. So you saw on my Twitter profile that I like to keep things simple. And so I don't use technical terms. I've noticed when you have some clinicians talking, you know, they talk about lead time, they talk about vectors, you know, and most of the people in the general public haven't got a clue what they're talking about. So whenever I'm talking, whether it's television or radio or just in print media, I always try and be as simple as possible, but still keep it accurate, but just translate things into simple language.
Thank you. And a question for Gideon: should journals be employing some basic checks based on your work, those distributions of those trailing digits, or any automated techniques for detecting fraud?
Yes. Easy answer. We actually, so my colleagues and I, Dr. Besançon, Heathers and Dick, a group of other people who've done this sort of stuff before, we recently published a paper in PLOS Biology where we recommend something like that. I think universities and journals should start doing stuff like this. I mean, I don't know enough to say specifically, but I can't imagine it's too hard to program an algorithm that would just check percentages, and that people have calculated their p-values for 2x2 tables correctly. Like, that sort of stuff seems to me quite simple.
Mm-hmm. But the will has to come from the editors, as you say.
Indeed. One thing that's very very consistent is that scientific editors, academic editors, genuinely don't really have anyone to answer to. So the only thing that forces change is public pressure. No study gets retracted unless it's in the news, even if it's demonstrably false.
Alberto has a question.
No, just a comment to both of you. Great talks, and Gideon more so. You know, the other part is not many journals have statistical consultants as reviewers or anything, right? It's people who think they know, and it looks good enough, right? So that's the other part that's a big missing. But you know, just love the talks. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, thank you. And I think it's also that peer review isn't, unless there is a specific statistical peer review, which, as you say, is very rare, peer review isn't designed to catch this sort of mistake, because no one redoes a model, no one like goes through their Jupyter notebook, reruns it, and then, you know, runs further sensitivity analyses. Even in a statistical review, like, that's relatively uncommon. You just assume that they've done their work reasonably correctly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Question from Adrian in the chat. What do both of you think of the idea of a national body for research integrity in Australia, I'm assuming there?
I think it'd be potentially a good idea. But these things do get political, so I guess it depends how it was implemented.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think Adrian might have frozen, so I'll exercise the chair's prerogative. You know, we've got a lot of statisticians on the call who might be thinking, whoa, these two smashed COVID. You know, you've both presented some really clearly impactful and impressive work. You know, if there are statisticians on the line who are thinking that they might like to venture into this space and communicate more, or try to put their own ideas out there, what would you recommend as maybe a first step or a small step?
I think Adrian actually kind of alluded to this in his talk, and he appears to have dropped out. But I would say, from my experience, if you start, you will. It's a skill that you have to practice, and you'll only get better in time. You know, it took me years before people started reading my Medium posts. I wasn't as fortunate as Adrian in that regard. You get better at communicating to the public. You get better at doing things like radio interviews. I mean, if you want to do something, so if you want to write, then start writing and get someone who's really an objective critic who can like point out whether you've done a good job or not. I think Adrian's coming back online, so you might want to ask him.
Good to have you back, Adrian. I was just asking Gideon, what, you know, for statisticians on the call who might want to begin a bit of a science communication journey like the one you've had, how would you recommend they start, or what might be a first step they could take? I think you're on mute.
There we are. Sorry, had a power failure in the whole building.
Oh gosh.
Typical. Look, I think try and get an article in the conversation is probably the best way to start your career as sort of in media. It can do the world of good. Certainly, I'm sort of the blue-eyed boy at the university at the moment, so I think that's the way to go. But if I can just comment on something that happened just before the power went off. I'm a CISC reviewer for quite a few medical journals. I'm an absolute bastard because I actually check percentages and make sure numbers add up.
Brilliant. Now, if every journal paid money to get someone like you on board, that would be a fantastic first step.
Okie doke. Well, we're right up against the hour. I'd like to thank both of our speakers today for sharing their experiences. They're pretty unique experiences, I think. We're planning a quarterly series, so 4 of these during the year. Please keep an eye on your inbox. If you'd like to recommend a speaker or have a question about the series, please get in touch. You can find the section on Twitter, which sounds like the place to be based on these talks.